London, 1892. The autumn-November air is thick with fog, the kind that clings to the streets and swallows sound. Outside the looming walls of Newgate Prison, a restless crowd has gathered. Vendors hawk coffee and pamphlets. Gossip ripples through the throng, and somewhere a child sits on his father's shoulders just to catch a glimpse of history in the making. Inside those walls, behind the iron gates, a man waits for the hangman's noose. His name is Thomas Neill Cream, a doctor by profession, but a poisoner by passion. Soon he will meet his end. Executions in Victorian London were no longer public spectacles, at least not in the bloody carnival fashion of the previous century. By the 1890s, hangings had moved inside prison yards, but that didn't stop the people from coming. Crowds still gathered, listening for the dull toll of the prison bell, waiting to watch the black flag rise, the grim signal that justice had been carried out. At precisely 9 o'clock, the doors creak open. Guards escort Cream forward. He is heavy-set, with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes. He walks stiffly, though not without dignity, as if he wants the world to see him not as a criminal, but as a man wronged. The gallows loom above him, a wooden frame, simple but final. The executioner, James Billington, is a professional. His rope is ready, his measurements exact. He places the noose around Cream's neck, the coarse fibers brushing against the doctor's skin. And then, the moment that would ignite more than a century of speculation. Witnesses later swore that Cream's lips began to move. He muttered something, low and guttural. Some claimed he whispered a prayer. Others said it was just a grunt. But a few insisted he uttered words that would echo across history. "I am Jack the..." And then the trapdoor snapped open. His body dropped. The rope jerked tight. Thomas Neill Cream was dead. The shock of that moment lingered in the air. Had London just executed Jack the Ripper himself? It was not so far-fetched a theory. After all, the Ripper's killing spree had terrorized Whitechapel just a few years earlier, in 1888. The city still carried the scars of those nights. The shadowed alleys, the whispered warnings, the endless ink spilled in newspapers. The identity of the Ripper had never been discovered. He had simply vanished, leaving a trail of horror behind. Now, with Cream's cryptic final words, the possibility resurfaced. Could this Canadian-born doctor, trained in medicine, skilled in poison, familiar with women of the streets, also have been the monster who disemboweled victims under the cloak of London fog? There was, however, one small problem. At the height of the Ripper killings, Thomas Neill Cream was not roaming the alleys of Whitechapel. He was not free to stalk the streets of London. He was thousands of miles away, locked behind bars in Joliet Prison in Illinois, serving time for poisoning one of his many victims. So how could he have been Jack the Ripper? Some said it was impossible, just another death row rumor, a man trying to steal the Ripper's notoriety with his dying breath. Others whispered conspiracies, that Cream had bribed his way out of prison, or had a double serving time in his place, that he slipped across the Atlantic, carved his bloody legend in Whitechapel, then returned to Illinois unnoticed. No one could prove it. No one could disprove it. And so, as the crowd outside Newgate dispersed, carrying the tale back into the city's taverns and drawing rooms, the myth was born. Thomas Neill Cream, doctor, poisoner, execution victim, and maybe, just maybe, Jack the Ripper. But to understand whether Cream was truly capable of being history's most infamous serial killer, we must rewind the clock. Before the gallows, before the Ripper rumors, before the whispered confession. Who was this man who called himself a doctor, but left a trail of women dead in his wake? The story begins not in London, but across the Atlantic, with a young man born into privilege, who would one day find himself addicted to murder. Thomas Neill Cream was born on May 27, 1850, in Glasgow, Scotland. But his story, like so many of the 19th century, is one of migration. When he was still a boy, his family crossed the Atlantic to Canada. They settled in Quebec, where his father, a wealthy builder and lumber merchant, provided a comfortable life for his children. Cream grew up with privilege, educated, well-dressed, and given opportunities that many of his contemporaries could only dream of. From a young age, he was considered bright, even gifted. He had the kind of charm that could win over strangers, and the ambition to climb as high as society would let him. But behind that polished exterior, there were already hints of the darkness that would consume him. A fascination with women, with control, and eventually, with the subtle power of poison. By the mid-1870s, Cream had dedicated himself to medicine. He enrolled at McGill University in Montreal, one of the most prestigious institutions in Canada, and in 1876, he graduated with a degree in medicine. His thesis? On chloroform and its effects on the human body, a subject that, in hindsight, feels chillingly appropriate. But Cream was restless. He wanted more than just a Canadian degree. He wanted the prestige of Europe. And so, in 1878, he traveled to Edinburgh, where he obtained further qualifications as a physician and surgeon. Edinburgh was one of the leading centers for medical education in the world, and there, Cream honed both his knowledge and his skill. By the time he finished, he had also spent time in London's medical schools, polishing the reputation he carefully curated for himself. The charming young doctor, educated in the great capitals of the English-speaking world. On paper, Thomas Neill Cream looked destined for success. He was brilliant, worldly, and impeccably trained. But behind closed doors, he was reckless, manipulative, and already experimenting with the kind of behavior that would one day make him infamous. One of the earliest windows into his darkness came not in London or Edinburgh, but back in Quebec, in a quiet town called Waterloo. It was there, in 1876, that Cream met a young woman named Flora Brooks. She was sweet, naive, and utterly unprepared for the storm that Cream would bring into her life. The young doctor courted her with charm and promises, and before long, she became pregnant. At the time, such a scandal could ruin a woman's reputation, and Cream, despite his wealth of education, was not about to let his future be derailed. Rather than honor his promise to marry Flora, Cream attempted something far darker. He tried to perform an abortion himself. The procedure went horribly wrong. Flora was left gravely ill, bedridden, hovering near death. And Cream? He tried to run. He fled to Montreal, leaving behind the wreckage of the woman he had seduced. But Flora's father caught up with him, and furious at what Cream had done, demanded he make things right. Cream was dragged back and forced to marry Flora Brooks. The very next day, literally within 24 hours of the wedding, Thomas Neill Cream abandoned her. He boarded a ship for England, continuing his medical education, never to see Flora or her family again. Flora herself survived the botched abortion, at least for a time, but she never fully recovered. In 1877, just a year after that, she died of consumption, tuberculosis. Officially, her death was chalked up to natural illness, but in Waterloo, whispers lingered. Some suspected that Cream had poisoned her to finally free himself from the inconvenient marriage. Whether or not that was true, one thing was certain. Thomas Neill Cream had proven himself willing to abandon, or destroy, any woman or anyone who stood in the way of his ambitions. From this point forward, a pattern emerged in his life. Women were not partners, not equals, not human beings deserving of care. They were conquests, amusements, or obstacles. And when obstacles arose, Cream reached for solutions that were as final as they were cruel. It was also during these years that Cream developed his fascination with poison. His weapon of choice was strychnine. Unlike arsenic or cyanide, which were becoming more detectable through advances in forensic science, strychnine was a subtler killer. It produced convulsions, muscle spasms, and a slow, agonizing death, often mistaken for tetanus or natural seizures. Detecting it in the body was nearly impossible with the technology of the time. For Cream, strychnine was the perfect tool. It gave him power. It gave him control. And most importantly, it gave him distance. He could play the role of the caring physician, the educated man of science, even as his patients writhed in agony from a poison only he knew how to administer. After leaving Flora behind and finishing his education in England, Cream returned to North America in 1878, searching for a place to establish himself. He spent a short time in Des Moines, Iowa, before relocating to London, Ontario, where he tried to build a practice. On the surface, he was everything a community might want in a doctor: well-trained, articulate, ambitious. But beneath that facade, the seeds of obsession were already growing. Women were drawn to him, but often regretted it. He used his medical knowledge not only to heal, but to manipulate. And when manipulation wasn't enough, poison was waiting in the wings. By the time Cream was 30, the trajectory of his life was clear. He was a man of brilliance, with every advantage the world could offer, and yet he was already on the path to becoming one of history's most notorious killers. His education had given him tools, but his nature gave him only one outlet: death. And soon, he would begin to use it. The story of Thomas Neill Cream's descent into murder doesn't begin in the fog of London streets, but in the growing cities of North America, where Victorian morality clashed with vice and where desperate women often had nowhere to turn. It was 1878, in the small city of London, Ontario. Cream had recently set up shop as a physician, presenting himself as a man of science, education, and opportunity. But there was one problem. He wasn't licensed to practice medicine there. That year, he was charged under Ontario's Medical Act with practicing without proper registration. Cream pleaded guilty. It should have been the end of his career in Canada, a stain on his record, a warning to patients. But it wasn't. Desperation has always been fertile ground for predators, and in the 19th century, desperate women, especially those seeking help with unwanted pregnancies, often had nowhere safe to go. Cream's reputation wasn't spotless, but he still had an office at 204 Dundas Street, and patients kept walking through his doors. Just a year later, tragedy struck. In 1879, the body of Catherine Hutchinson Gardner was found in a privy behind Cream's office. She was pregnant. She had been murdered with a handkerchief soaked in chloroform. Gardner's death shook the community, but the details only deepened the mystery. Cream insisted he had refused to perform an abortion for her. Instead, he claimed Gardner had begged him to accuse a local businessman of being the father of her child. According to Cream, when he refused, she threatened to poison herself. To bolster his story, Cream produced a letter, supposedly written by Gardner herself, naming the businessman as the father. But when her family and roommates saw it, they were stunned. The handwriting was all wrong. The signature didn't match. To them, it was a crude forgery. The authorities, however, didn't press the issue. Despite rumors, suspicions, and damning circumstantial evidence, no further action was taken. Gardner's case was quietly left unresolved. For Thomas Neill Cream, it was a lesson. With enough confidence, charm, and lies, he could walk away from death untouched. By the early 1880s, Cream had relocated to Chicago, a city booming with industry and with vice. The red light districts were filled with brothels, saloons, and boarding houses. It was here, among the most vulnerable women, that Cream built a thriving but deadly business. He opened a practice conveniently located near the brothels. Officially, he was a physician. In reality, he was performing illegal abortions, a risky trade that often ended in infection, complications, or death. In August 1880, one of his patients, Mary Ann Faulkner, died after what Cream described as an operation. Locals whispered about his methods, but the law required hard evidence. Cream walked free once again. Then, in December of that year, another patient, known only as Miss Stack, died after treatment by Cream. But this time, the doctor's arrogance nearly tripped him up. Rather than covering his tracks, he attempted to blackmail the pharmacist who had filled a prescription linked to Stack's case. It was a reckless move, suggesting Cream wasn't just motivated by greed or lust, but also by a compulsion to control, manipulate, and dominate. And yet, he still escaped justice. The deaths continued. In April 1881, a woman named Alice Montgomery died of strychnine poisoning after undergoing an abortion at a rooming house barely a block from Cream's office. The case was ruled a murder, but no one was charged. 3 women dead in less than a year, all linked by geography, circumstances, and method. But Thomas Neill Cream was still free, still practicing, and still charming those around him. And then came the case that would finally put him behind bars. On July 14, 1881, a man named Daniel Stott died suddenly in his Boone County, Illinois home. Stott was 61 years old, suffering from epilepsy. His wife, Julia Abby Stott, had brought him a remedy, supplied, of course, by Dr. Cream. Within hours of taking it, Daniel convulsed violently and died. The death was at first attributed to natural causes, an unfortunate turn in the life of an aging, ailing man. But then Cream made his move. In an astonishing act of hubris, he wrote to the county coroner, suggesting that the pharmacist who had dispensed the medication was responsible. It wasn't grief or guilt that motivated him. It was his familiar game of blackmail, twisting death into leverage. But this time, it backfired. Investigators began to look closer at Daniel Stott's death, and soon, Julia Stott cracked. She admitted she had become Cream's lover, and more damningly, she confessed that Cream had given her the poison, instructing her to use it to kill her husband. Julia turned state's evidence. She painted Cream as the mastermind, the manipulative doctor who had seduced her and plotted Daniel's death. The case was airtight. The trial of Thomas Neill Cream for the murder of Daniel Stott opened in November 1881, and from the start, it was clear the prosecution had a compelling case. Cream, dressed sharply and carrying himself with the air of a man who still considered himself above reproach, seemed confident he could outwit the court, just as he had outmaneuvered investigators in the past. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses confirmed that Cream had supplied Julia Stott with capsules of what he claimed was medicine. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of strychnine, the very poison that had convulsed and killed Daniel Stott. The pharmacist corroborated the prescription, and Julia's testimony tied everything together. Her affair with Cream, his instructions to administer the poison, and his manipulative promises of a new life together. Cream did not confess. On the contrary, he attempted to deflect blame, pointing fingers at the pharmacist, and even suggesting Julia herself had acted independently. His courtroom demeanor swung between charm and arrogance, sometimes attempting to reason with the jury, other times smirking as though the proceedings were beneath him. The jury was unmoved. After just a short deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict. Thomas Neill Cream was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at Joliet Prison in Illinois. For once, his intelligence, medical training, and silver tongue had not saved him. The walls of Joliet closed in, and many believed the story of Thomas Neill Cream had reached its end. For many, it seemed justice had finally caught up with him. His reputation was ruined, his medical career destroyed, and he was locked away behind bars for the rest of his life. Or so it seemed. Prison didn't reform Cream. If anything, it deepened his resentment, his arrogance, and his hunger for control. He became known as an educated inmate, sometimes working in the prison hospital. But inside his mind, the obsessions that had driven him before, sex, poison, death, power, simmered unchecked. Then, in July 1891, after nearly a decade behind bars, Thomas Neill Cream walked free. How? The story is as murky as the rest of his life. Officially, his brother pleaded for leniency, appealing to the governor of Illinois, Joseph W. Pfeiffer, for commutation of the sentence. But behind the scenes, whispers of bribery circulated. Money had exchanged hands. Influential figures may have been persuaded to act. Whatever the truth, the outcome was clear. A convicted murderer, a man who had poisoned patients, blackmailed pharmacists, and manipulated lovers into murder, was now free again. And he wasted no time returning to his old ways. By now, Thomas Neill Cream had already killed at least 4 people, possibly much more. Women in Ontario, Chicago, and Illinois had paid the price for his vanity and cruelty. But his story was far from over, because in just a few months, he would return to England. And there, he would unleash a new wave of poisonings that would shock Victorian society, and forever link his name, however questionably, to Jack the Ripper. London, 1891. The city was a churning, restless machine, alive with industry and poverty, splendor and squalor. In the elegant neighborhoods west of the Thames, gentlemen in polished boots hurried into clubs and offices, while only a mile or 2 away in Lambeth, the air stank of coal smoke and refuse. Here, among the alleys and cramped tenements, thousands of the working poor scraped by. Factory girls, laborers, petty thieves, and sex workers who plied their trade in shadowed corners or in cheap rooms above gin shops. It was here, in Lambeth, that Thomas Neill Cream resurfaced after nearly a decade behind prison walls. His father had died in 1887, and Cream, ever the manipulator, now had an inheritance to draw from. That money bought him a new start. In 1891, he crossed the Atlantic and settled at 103 Lambeth Palace Road, a modest lodging house not far from the river. To the casual observer, he was just another middle-aged doctor with Scottish roots, perhaps a bit eccentric, but nothing more. But Cream had not changed. If anything, Joliet Prison had hardened him, fed his bitterness. Now he was free, wealthy enough to live without working, and once again in the heart of a great city, filled with exactly the sort of prey he desired. Vulnerable women, easy to lure, and unlikely to be mourned. And once again, his weapon of choice was strychnine, a bitter, crystalline powder, derived from the seeds of a tropical tree. Strychnine caused a uniquely agonizing death. Muscles convulsed, jaws locked, the body arched backward in terrible spasms until the victim's spine nearly snapped. Breathing became impossible, and yet consciousness often remained until the very end. It was torture masquerading as medicine, and for Cream, it was the perfect tool. Few doctors could reliably identify it in an autopsy, and death could easily be misattributed to seizures, tetanus, or even alcohol withdrawal. The first to die in London was Ellen Donworth, known to her friends as Nellie. She was just 19 years old, a girl who had come to the city looking for work and ended up surviving through sex work. On the night of October 13th, 1891, Nellie met Cream. He had already courted her with letters, 2 written in his peculiar hand, flattering but strange. When they met in person, he produced a small bottle and invited her to drink. Perhaps she thought it was alcohol, or perhaps medicine. Either way, she trusted him enough to swallow what he gave her. That night, Nellie collapsed in the street, writhing in violent convulsions. Neighbors rushed to help, but within hours she was dead. The inquest determined that she had been poisoned with strychnine. If Cream had simply stopped there, perhaps suspicion might never have turned toward him. But Cream's vanity, his need to be at the center of the story, compelled him to interfere. He wrote a letter to the coroner under the name A. O'Brien, detective, offering to solve the case in exchange for an absurdly high reward, £300,000. He also wrote to W. H. Smith, the wealthy newspaper and bookstall magnate, accusing him of Nellie's murder and demanding money for his silence. It was a reckless move. His letters showed a pattern, always pointing fingers, always demanding blackmail money, always trying to insert himself into investigations. But at the time, no one connected the strange correspondence to Cream himself. Just a week later, on October 20th, 1891, Cream struck again. His next victim was Matilda Clover, a 27-year-old sex worker. Cream gave her several pills, telling her to take 4 before bed. Trusting the supposed doctor, Matilda complied. That night, she was gripped by spasms so violent that her neighbors could hear her screams. Within 2 hours, she was dead. But unlike Nellie, Matilda's death was not immediately recognized as murder. Doctors at the time assumed she had succumbed to alcohol withdrawal, a common affliction in the slums. The case was quietly closed, and Matilda was buried. Again, Cream could not resist meddling. Under the alias M. Malone, he wrote to the celebrated physician Sir William Broadbent, accusing him of Clover's death and demanding £25,000. The letter was forwarded to Scotland Yard, and detectives arranged a sting operation, hoping to catch the blackmailer when he came to collect. But Cream was too cautious, or too paranoid. He never appeared. In early April 1892, Cream returned to London after a trip back to Canada, where he had been vacationing and spending freely from his inheritance. Refreshed and emboldened, he prowled Lambeth again. One evening, he met Louise Harvey, also known as Louise Harris, a sex worker with a sharp instinct for danger. Cream invited her out, charming and attentive, and at the end of the night he pressed 2 capsules into her hand. "Take them now," he urged. Louise hesitated. Something about his insistence unsettled her. Pretending to obey, she slipped the pills into her mouth, but as soon as Cream looked away, she spat them into her hand and later tossed them into the street. That decision saved her life. On the night of April 11th, 1892, Cream found 2 new victims, Alice Marsh, age 21, and Emma Shrevell, just 18. The young women invited him to their flat, where they ate, drank, and laughed late into the night. Cream, ever generous, offered them capsules as a parting gift. Medicine, he claimed, to help them sleep. Both women swallowed the pills. Hours later, their neighbors awoke to the sound of screams. Alice and Emma convulsed in their beds, their bodies jerking violently, their mouths frothing, their cries echoing through the thin walls. By dawn, both were dead. The cause, again, was strychnine poisoning. But the deaths were dismissed as either an accident or a coincidence. In a city where poverty, disease, and alcohol claimed lives daily, 2 young sex workers barely made the news. For a time, Cream seemed untouchable. His victims were women of the margins, sex workers, poor, often assumed to be reckless with their health. Their deaths stirred little outrage, but Cream could not resist writing letters, spinning wild accusations, and seeking blackmail money from prominent men. And slowly, suspicion began to gather. Detectives at Scotland Yard noted the peculiar pattern: the deaths of women in Lambeth, always sudden and agonizing, always unexplained. And then, the anonymous letters, each one dripping with accusations and demands. Who was the mysterious writer? And could he be tied to the deaths that were otherwise slipping past the coroner's tables? By the spring of 1892, the pieces were falling into place. The poisoner's arrogance, once his shield, was beginning to betray him. By the spring of 1892, whispers were circling London's underworld. 4 young women, Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrevell, were all dead. Their deaths, spread across just 6 months, shared eerie similarities: sudden, violent spasms, agonizing convulsions, and a mysterious connection to a so-called doctor who lurked in Lambeth. At first, these tragedies had seemed like isolated misfortunes, the kind that barely made headlines in a city where poverty swallowed thousands every year. But soon, a pattern began to emerge. Detectives noticed it, journalists hinted at it, and those who worked the streets of Lambeth began whispering about a predator who looked like a gentleman, but dealt only in death. The press eventually gave him a name: the Lambeth Poisoner. Had Thomas Neill Cream been content to kill and remain silent, he might have gone unnoticed far longer. But Cream's arrogance, his desperate craving for notoriety, drew the noose tighter around his own neck. He couldn't resist writing letters, dozens of them. He wrote to coroners, to wealthy men, to physicians, to journalists. He accused strangers of murder and demanded vast sums of money in exchange for his silence. Each letter was laced with self-importance, as though the writer relished not just in killing, but in knowing more than everyone else. But in his recklessness, Cream made a mistake, a devastating one. In a letter intended to blackmail, he accused Sir William Broadbent, one of Britain's most respected physicians, of being involved in the death of Matilda Clover. There was just one problem. Clover's death certificate listed the cause as natural, a seizure brought on by alcohol abuse. The coroner had never declared it murder. The public had never even suspected foul play. So how, investigators wondered, did this anonymous blackmailer know she had been poisoned? The answer was obvious. Only the killer himself could have known. Scotland Yard began working quietly. They studied the letters, noted the handwriting, and gathered reports from Lambeth about a strange doctor who loitered in lodging houses, plying women with drinks or pills. Meanwhile, the newspapers stoked the fire. The public learned of the mysterious deaths, of the growing suspicion that a poisoner stalked the city's streets. Sensational headlines shouted about the Lambeth Poisoner and his reign of terror. Instead of retreating into silence, Cream grew bolder. He boasted of his knowledge, hinted at his involvement, and seemed almost to enjoy dancing on the edge of suspicion. He was, in many ways, daring the police to catch him. Then came another blunder. One afternoon, Cream met a policeman from New York City who was visiting London. The officer had heard of the Lambeth Poisoner and was curious about the case. Cream, ever eager to play the expert, offered to give him a personal tour of the crime scenes. And so he did, pointing out where Ellen Donworth had lived, where Matilda Clover had died, and even recounting details about Alice Marsh and Emma Shrevell that had never appeared in the press. The New Yorker thought little of it at first, but when he later mentioned this curious tour to a British policeman, the reaction was immediate. How could Cream possibly know so much unless he had been directly involved? The net was tightening, and Cream had all but woven it himself. Detectives at Scotland Yard now had a prime suspect, and they moved quickly. They placed Cream under surveillance. For weeks, plainclothes officers shadowed him through Lambeth, watching as he sought out sex workers, invited them for walks, and occasionally pressed small bottles or capsules into their hands. His behavior matched perfectly with the stories of survivors, like Louise Harvey, the woman who had pretended to swallow his pills and lived to tell the tale. Investigators also began digging into his past, and what they uncovered was a gold mine. Through correspondence with authorities in the United States and Canada, Scotland Yard pieced together Cream's dark history. They learned that in Illinois in 1881, he had been convicted of murdering Daniel Stott, a man poisoned with strychnine after his wife began an affair with Cream. They learned of other mysterious deaths in Chicago, young women, many of them sex workers, who had perished after visiting Cream for abortions or medical treatments. They learned of the blackmail attempts in America, nearly identical to the ones he was now perpetrating in London. And they confirmed that he had only recently been released from prison in Joliet, after serving barely a decade of a life sentence. The picture was clear. The Lambeth Poisoner wasn't some shadowy new menace. He was an old killer, newly arrived in London, resuming the only career he had ever truly cared for: murder. Police collected statements from witnesses. The landladies who had seen Cream enter or leave with young women. The pharmacists who had filled suspicious prescriptions. Survivors like Louise Harvey, whose intuition had saved her life. They also traced the paper and ink of his blackmail letters, comparing them to samples taken from his room. The handwriting was an unmistakable match. Day by day, the case grew stronger and bigger. Still, Scotland Yard knew they had to be careful. Cream was not only clever but wealthy, with the means to hire skilled lawyers. A botched arrest or flimsy case could see him walk free. The police needed certainty. By the summer of 1892, Cream must have sensed the eyes on him. He grew restless, pacing Lambeth streets, writing more letters, boasting to acquaintances about his supposed knowledge of the poisonings. But his ego betrayed him at every turn. Detectives followed as he visited chemists, purchasing strychnine under the guise of medical use. They listened as he dropped cryptic remarks about deaths that only the killer could know. Even among his acquaintances, Cream seemed unable to stop talking. He made morbid jokes about poison. He bragged of knowing who had killed the women of Lambeth. Some later swore he practically admitted his guilt outright, though few took him seriously at the time. But Scotland Yard took him very seriously indeed. The summer of 1892 was restless in London. Rumors and whispers traveled faster than the trains that cut through the city, and one name, half known, half feared, was beginning to circulate among the public and the press. The Lambeth Poisoner was no longer just an urban legend whispered about in pubs or printed in sensationalist columns. Scotland Yard had its eyes on a man, a doctor, a killer. On the 3rd of June 1892, the police made their move. Thomas Neill Cream, who had been living quietly at 103 Lambeth Palace Road, was arrested for the murder of Matilda Clover. At first, Cream seemed calm, even smug, as though this were an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. But the charge sheet grew longer. By 13th July, authorities formally indicted him not only for Clover's murder, but also for the deaths of Ellen, Nellie Donworth, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrivel, as well as the attempted murder of Louise Harvey. There was more. The blackmail letters he had written, those reckless, arrogant attempts to frame others and demand money, were tied directly to him. The Crown added charges of extortion, and suddenly Cream's world of confidence and control began to collapse. From the very beginning, Cream fought to distance himself from his past. He insisted to police, reporters, and anyone who would listen that he was not Thomas Neill Cream, the disgraced doctor with a history of scandal in Canada and the United States. He was simply Dr. Thomas Neill, he argued, a man of learning and refinement, caught in a misunderstanding. The newspapers, perhaps eager for the dramatic flair of it all, often obliged by calling him Dr. Neill in their stories. But behind the scenes, Scotland Yard had already gathered a damning portfolio. His criminal record, his prison term in Illinois, and his reputation as a poisoner who had resurfaced in London like a plague. This wasn't just another murder trial. It was becoming a media spectacle, a courtroom drama that would grip London and, soon enough, much of the English-speaking world. The trial opened on the 17th of October, 1892, in the Old Bailey, before Justice Henry Hawkins, a man known for his stern demeanor, razor-sharp questioning, and intolerance for theatrics. Hawkins had built his career on commanding juries with authority, and he was not about to let a poisonous doctor turn his courtroom into a stage. From the very start, the courtroom was packed. Journalists fought for space, sketch artists captured Cream's image for the illustrated papers, and curious Londoners queued in the hope of witnessing the infamous doctor face justice. Cream, true to form, played the part of the respectable professional. He arrived dressed in proper attire, attempting to maintain the air of a cultured man wrongfully accused. He spoke with careful precision, sometimes even with arrogance, as if he still believed he might outwit the Crown. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline of deaths. Ellen Donworth's sudden convulsions, the mysterious collapse of Matilda Clover, the violent demise of Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel. All followed a strikingly similar pattern. Young women, each linked in some way to the doctor, each poisoned with strychnine. Medical experts testified that the symptoms, agonizing spasms, clenched muscles, death within hours, were unmistakable signs of strychnine poisoning. In Clover's case, her death certificate had originally listed natural causes, but the blackmail letter Cream later wrote to Dr. William Broadbent had exposed his knowledge of her murder. How could anyone but the killer know that Clover had not simply died of heart trouble? That detail alone cut through the defense like a knife. Then came the letters. The jury read aloud Cream's anonymous threats, written under names like M. Malone and A. O'Brien, detective. He had accused innocent men of murder, demanding vast sums of money in exchange for silence. His arrogance had left a trail of handwriting, paper, and style that experts easily tied back to him. One witness, Louise Harvey, survived to tell her story. She described how Cream had pressed her to take the pills he gave her, how she had pretended to swallow them, but cleverly disposed of them later. Her testimony was devastating, living proof that the doctor had tried and failed to kill her in the same way he had killed the others. Other witnesses recalled seeing him with the victims shortly before their deaths. Some had received letters from him directly. Others remembered his odd, almost desperate attempts to impress people with his knowledge of the Lambeth murders. The pattern was undeniable. Despite the avalanche of evidence, Cream refused to fold. He did not confess. He did not admit guilt. Instead, his lawyers tried to chip away at the prosecution's case, suggesting coincidences, possible alternative causes of death, and questioning whether the letters could truly be proven to be Cream's. But it was weak. Even Cream's attempts to maintain his identity as merely Dr. Neill rang hollow against the backdrop of his history. Investigators had traced him back through North America, uncovering his earlier conviction for poisoning and his years in prison. This was not the first time he had stood accused of killing with strychnine. Still, Cream carried himself with a kind of bizarre confidence during the proceedings. At times he leaned forward, smirking, as though amused. At others, he grew agitated, correcting details, arguing over points of testimony as if he were the cleverest man in the room. He seemed to believe, perhaps until the very end, that his intelligence could save him. But it did not. On 21st October 1892, after only 5 days of testimony, evidence, and argument, the jury retired to deliberate. It took them just 12 minutes. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Justice Hawkins delivered the sentence. His words were measured but absolute. Thomas Neill Cream was condemned to death. The doctor who had cloaked himself in respectability, who had preyed upon women while hiding behind medical authority, would hang for his crimes. Cream showed little emotion. Perhaps he had expected this ending all along. Perhaps the mask of arrogance had finally cracked, leaving only resignation. But London's papers wasted no time in branding him forever. The Doctor of Death, the Lambeth Poisoner, the man who poisoned for pleasure and for profit. The trial was over, but the final act of the story, his execution, still awaited, and with it, the most enduring mystery of all, his alleged last words on the scaffold. The trial was over. The verdict had been swift, the sentence inevitable. Thomas Neill Cream, the so-called Doctor of Death, was condemned to die by hanging. In the fall of 1892, the gallows at Newgate Prison awaited him. For centuries, Newgate had been the grim stage where London's most notorious criminals met their end. Its stone walls carried the weight of countless last breaths, its flagstones marked by initials of the condemned who had gone before. Soon, another letter, C, would join them. In the days leading up to his execution, Cream's arrogance and peculiar sense of control never entirely abandoned him. On the 14th of November, 1892, the day before he was to die, he drew up a new will. This will revoked a previous one he had made in January of the same year. That earlier document had named Miss Laura Sabatini of Berkhamsted as his executor and heir. Sabatini was a young woman he had become engaged to during his time in London. She, like many others, seemed to fall under the spell of his charm, his profession, and his carefully cultivated air of refinement. Perhaps Cream believed he could fashion a new life with her, as though his past would never catch up to him. But now, with the hangman only hours away, Cream cut her out. Instead, he left his estate to his solicitors. Cold, clinical, and calculated to the very end. The morning of the execution was damp and gray. A crowd gathered outside the walls of Newgate, as they always did on such occasions, waiting to hear the tolling of the bell that would announce another life ended at the gallows. Public executions had long since been abolished, but the fascination remained. People wanted to know, what would the infamous Lambeth Poisoner's last words be? Inside the prison, the ritual unfolded as it always did. Cream was led from his cell by the warders. His steps were heavy but steady, his face pale but composed. Some accounts say he muttered prayers under his breath. Others claim he remained defiant, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing fear. The hangman that day was James Billington, a man who had carried out dozens of executions and who would later claim this one was unlike any other. At a few minutes past 9 o'clock, Cream was placed upon the scaffold. The rope was fitted around his neck, the white hood drawn over his head. Silence fell. And then, it happened. Billington himself would later insist that just as he pulled the lever, just as the trapdoor opened beneath Cream's feet, the doctor's lips moved. His final words, Billington claimed, were, "I am Jack the—" The rope snapped taut, the body jerked downward, and the phrase was cut off forever. Billington promoted the story widely, relishing his claim that he had hanged not only the Lambeth Poisoner, but also perhaps the most infamous murderer in history, Jack the Ripper. The tale was irresistible, and newspapers repeated it with relish. Could it be true? Had Cream, in his very last breath, confessed to being the man who stalked Whitechapel in 1888? The problem, of course, is that the story does not withstand scrutiny. For one thing, none of the prison officials, police, or other witnesses present at the execution ever recorded such a statement. Their reports were meticulous, and yet there is no mention of Cream attempting to confess or even uttering those words. For another, the timeline makes it impossible. In 1888, when Jack the Ripper carved terror into the streets of Whitechapel, Thomas Neill Cream was locked inside Joliet Prison in Illinois, serving a life sentence for murder. He would not be released until 1891. Unless he had the ability to be in two places at once, Cream could not have been the Ripper. Most historians believe that Billington, eager to enhance his own notoriety and perhaps sell a more sensational story, invented the claim. It was a macabre flourish, but one that has endured in popular imagination. Still, whether true or false, the phrase has cemented itself into the legend of Thomas Neill Cream. Even in death, he managed to cloak himself in mystery, ensuring his name would echo long after his body was lowered into the earth. As was customary, Cream's body was buried the same day, beneath the flagstones of Newgate Prison. There was no funeral procession, no mourning crowd, just a hole in the ground among other executed criminals, marked only by a single initial, C. In 1902, a decade after his death, the remains of those buried at Newgate were disinterred and transferred to the City of London Cemetery in East London. There, in an unmarked grave, Cream lies to this day. No headstone bears his name, no epitaph recalls his deeds. He is dust among dust, remembered only in stories, in court records, and in the haunting legacy of the Lambeth Poisoner. So how do we remember Thomas Neill Cream? He was not Jack the Ripper, that much is certain. But in some ways, his crimes were just as chilling. Unlike the Ripper, whose murders stopped as suddenly as they began, Cream killed across decades and continents. From Canada to the United States, and finally to London, his weapon was not a knife, but a powder, a poison, a capsule that could be slipped into the hands of the unsuspecting. He was a doctor, trained to heal, who instead turned his knowledge of medicine into a tool of death. A man who might have saved lives instead watched women convulse and die by his hand, sometimes for money, sometimes for blackmail, and perhaps, most chilling of all, sometimes simply for the thrill of it. His case raised disturbing questions that echo even now. Why do men like Cream kill? Is it greed? The lure of money? Is it power? The control over life and death? Or is it the darkest hunger of all, the sheer thrill of destruction? Thomas Neill Cream forces us to confront the blurred line between healer and destroyer, between respectability and depravity. He was a man with privilege, education, and opportunity, advantages denied to so many of his victims. Yet he squandered all of it in pursuit of murder and notoriety. In the end, justice caught up with him. But his story lingers as a reminder of how fragile the boundary can be between those sworn to preserve life and those willing to extinguish it. Cream's name may not carry the same infamy as Jack the Ripper, but in his own way, he was every bit as terrifying. The Lambeth Poisoner, the Doctor of Death, the man who poisoned not only his victims, but also the trust that society places in those who wear the mantle of healer. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Thomas Neill Cream. Not his disputed last words, nor his sensational trial, but the unsettling truth that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in the shadows of the street, but in the hands of the very people we trust to keep us alive.